have blood, and I've had students say to bleed. That's not why we have blood. We don't have blood to bleed. We have blood to move things. It transports things throughout the body. And what are some of the important things that blood transports around the body?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. And how does it transport oxygen?
Hemoglobin.
Attached to the hemoglobin molecule. And where's the hemoglobin molecule found? In abundance. Platelets. Red blood cells. Red blood cells are packed chock-a-block full of hemoglobin, in and on, in fact, all kind of hemoglobin. That is an important concept. The way Bruce Colbert has once described it, and I thought it was a brilliant description. I haven't been able to come up with anything better, so I have to use his word. The red blood cell is like a bus, and the hemoglobin molecule is like a seat on the bus. And the oxygen molecule is like a passenger sitting on a seat on the bus. Now, where do all the passengers get picked up? They get picked up in the part of the body called the lungs. I would have written lungs there, and that would have made it much easier to figure out what I'm pointing to right now. Sorry about that. We get our oxygen, of course, when we breathe in the air from rooms like this. How much oxygen is in this room? What percentage? Approximately about 20% or so, right? We know that it's not 100% oxygen. We know it's not 0% oxygen. But we know it is only a certain percentage of oxygen that we actually breathe in. So those oxygen molecules cross the alveolar membrane, cross into the capillaries, and even cross into the red blood cell membrane. Those oxygen molecules are the passengers getting on the bus, that is the red blood cell. They take their seats, they fill up the seats, and the red blood cell, the bus, leaves the lungs. It leaves the lungs to go back to the heart to get pumped out throughout the rest of the body. As the red blood cell makes it to the capillaries, then the oxygen starts to get off. It gets off of the bus, it goes through the tissues, through the cells that need them, diffusing cell to cell if necessary. And then the bus continues on its journey. Now, here's where people get a little bit confused. We do not have a perfect oxygen system. In other words, when that bus returns to the lungs, it is not completely empty. It has not dropped off every bit of oxygen. That's an important concept for later on, when you're out in the field, when you're doing CPR. That's an important concept, important thing that you need to understand. That red blood cell is not void of oxygen. There's still oxygen molecules on that bus. It's just not full. When it goes back to the lungs, it gets full again. And then it gets shot out into the circulation, where it goes through, it stops in the capillaries, and drops off the passenger's oxygen again. Returning to the lungs, still with some oxygen, still with some passengers. Why is this important? Because if we're doing CPR, what are we trying to save?
Brain.
We are trying to save the brain. We're not trying to save the heart. So we are actually doing what the heart is not doing, which is pumping. So we're trying to push those red blood cells with that oxygen up to the brain. That's the idea. That's what we're trying to do, to get that oxygen up there. Does that make sense? So we don't have to necessarily go down and give this person any breaths, because the reality is we're not going to be giving them a lot of oxygen anyway. Because if we take a breath in, some of that oxygen that is in this air that we took into our lungs is now going to diffuse across our lungs, even diffuse across our membranes. So that when we blow into their mouth, they're still not even getting 20% oxygen. They're getting less than that. And if we do CPR correctly, which is forcefully, we are going to be compressing the lungs so that every time we release, what's going to happen? The lungs are going to rebound to some extent, and they're actually going to pull some of this outside air in. So it would be better just to make sure their airway is open so that they can get some of that air rushing in. But even if they can't, we still want to make sure we get that blood that's in their system that still has oxygen up to their brain. So that's why we're doing those compressions. So I know a lot of people have learned that after 30 compressions you do a couple of breaths. I'm telling you, it would probably be better just to keep doing compressions, with a few exceptions. If you have a bag on them, we can force air in, that can certainly be helpful. But otherwise, just keep doing compressions. All right, so blood carries oxygen, but it doesn't carry free oxygen. It carries oxygen bound to hemoglobin molecules, which is really just the seat on the bus, and the bus, of course, being the red blood cell. The red blood cell packs, they pack our blood. And there are so many red blood cells in our blood that it actually makes our blood look red. That's what gives blood our red color. It's the red blood cells. And what gives the red blood cell its color? The hemoglobin molecule. Don't listen to them, listen to me. The hemoglobin molecule, because the hemoglobin molecule is red for a reason. What's attached to the hemoglobin molecule? Iron. And that's going to give the hemoglobin molecule its red color. So in other words, there's so much hemoglobin that looks red because of the iron. So much hemoglobin packed inside not a red blood cell makes a red blood cell look red. And there are so many red blood cells in the blood, it makes the blood look red. I know a lot of people still say blood is blue until it's exposed to oxygen. It just isn't true. It's more of a darker red or a purplish red, but it's still red. What other things does our blood carry?
Nutrients.
Like what?
Glucose.
Glucose, good nutrient. We need glucose. What else?
Electrolytes,
Electrolytes, like what?
potassium.
Potassium, sodium.
Carbon dioxide.
I didn't hear that. I heard
I said carbon dioxide.
But how? In what form does it carry carbon dioxide? It doesn't carry carbon dioxide as carbon dioxide. It carries it as some other molecule.
Carbonate. Bicarbonate.
Bicarbonate.
HCO3.
It carries carbon dioxide as bicarbonate, and then it gets changed to carbon dioxide where? And this is the part that I did not label, right? Okay. Absolutely magnesium. We'll find magnesium. But back one to bicarbonate, first of all. Understand something. Bicarbonate has a negative charge. Bicarbonate can accept protons. In other words, bicarbonate is a buffer. Remember we talked about acids and bases, acids, alkalines? This is the thing that helps to maintain our blood pH as high as it is. This is the most potent extracellular buffer that we have. So bicarbonate's important. All right, magnesium, definitely. What else?
Hormones.
Hormones, absolutely. Isn't that what hormones are? They are chemical messages that are sent specifically by the blood. And then our blood is made up of two main parts, formed elements and a liquid part. The liquid part is called plasma. And plasma is mostly made up of what?
Water.
Water. About 55% of the blood is plasma, and about 90% of plasma is water. Therefore, almost half of blood is water. Now, not only does blood transport these things through our body, it makes a nice storage place. Glucose is brought up, right? We need glucose in all of our cells. So if we maintain a steady amount of glucose in our blood all the time, that sort of acts as storage for when we do need it in our cells. We just take what we need. Makes sense, right? Then, of course, we're going to have things like insulin. Insulin's going to get transported around by a big protein called albumin. Albumin is the largest, most abundant, actually, protein that we have in our blood. It's a transport protein, like to ship things around. Lipids, right? Fats, cholesterol transporters. How about antibodies? All these things found in our blood. What about bacteria? Do we find bacteria in our blood? Hopefully not. If we find bacteria in our blood, that is a disease state. What do we call that? That is called septicemia. That is not good. Blood should be sterile. And so when we talk about the kidneys, since we're filtering blood, the filtrate, which is going to become urine, should also be sterile. And so forth. All right, so the cardiovascular system is really the system to transport the transport medium around the body, transport blood around the body. The main thing that pumps the blood around the body, this is going to surprise you, it's the heart. It's the main organ that's going to pump blood around the body. Now, I think it's easier if you think of the heart as two separate pumps that just happen to be right next to each other. And again, I know that most of you have a background in anatomy, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to assume that you know that the heart is made up of 4 chambers, and that there are 2 upper chambers called the atria, the right atrium and left atrium, and 2 ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The right side of the heart is responsible for collecting all of that blood that has dropped off the oxygen. So all of the blood that's coming into the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava, there's also one little coronary sinus that empties in here. All the blood that's coming back into the heart, into the right side of the heart, specifically the right atrium, is low in oxygen. It's not, doesn't have zero oxygen, it's low in oxygen, which is why we say this is deoxygenated blood. It is deoxygenated. It's had the oxygen, much of the oxygen removed, but not completely. So, if we have a bus that doesn't have passengers, doesn't have oxygen, where does it pick up oxygen? The lungs. So if we have all these red blood cells that have to get oxygen, where are we going to ship them to? We're going to ship them to the lungs, very simply. So all of this blood that is low in oxygen is going to get shot over to the lungs. Well, that's what the right side of the heart does. It collects all of this blood that is low in oxygen, it collects it in the right atrium, so the right atrium fills up. And then the right atrium pumps downward and pumps the blood into the large ventricle below. The large ventricle below has a great deal more muscle because it has to pump with a great deal more force because it has to pump against a great deal more resistance. So it is going to pump the blood out and into the pulmonary trunk, which is going to branch off into the right and left pulmonary arteries. And it's going to shoot that blood that is low in oxygen over to the lungs. It's going to branch off, the pulmonary arteries will branch off into smaller arteries and then arterioles and then capillaries. And at that point, we will have that bicarbonate changing back into carbon dioxide and leaving. And we'll have oxygen coming from the air that we breathed in, moving from our lungs into our blood across the membranes, diffusing across the membranes, and binding to the hemoglobin molecule. Now, what is the driving force of oxygen coming from the lung alveoli across the membranes to the red blood cell? I'll give you a hint. It's the same driving force that's causing carbon dioxide to leave and go into the alveoli. Diffusion, concentration gradient. There's more oxygen here, there's less oxygen here, so oxygen wants to move this way. There's more carbon dioxide here, less carbon dioxide here, so carbon dioxide wants to move that way. Does that make sense? That's what drives it. Now, the seats on that bus are very special. You got to think of them like those roller coaster rides. You know, the roller coaster rides, you sit in and they lock you into place. They're very unique to the oxygen molecule in that when the oxygen binds in the lungs, that hemoglobin molecule has to take on a very specific shape. That seat has to take on a very specific shape to accept that oxygen, to grab onto it, to lock it into place. 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin molecule, so we have 4 chains. It's important because when that bus takes that oxygen down to the capillaries, down at this level, the smallest of the blood vessels, that hemoglobin molecule has to change its shape. It has to release. You know, the big roller coaster bar has to come up. Because otherwise, it wouldn't release the oxygen. So the hemoglobin molecule has to have what we call conformational change occur at the pressure of the capillary, which is different at the pressure of the lungs. This is important when we start talking about babies. Because remember, when babies are developing in the uterus, where does a baby get its oxygen? It's not breathing air in the uterus. In fact, its lungs aren't going to be working for at least week 22, 24, something like that anyway. And there's no oxygen there for it to get. So it's going to rely on mom's oxygen delivery. But understand something. Oxygen, mom's hemoglobin has to release the oxygen in order for baby's hemoglobin to pick it up. So baby has to have a different type of hemoglobin molecule that has a different conformational shape. So we'll see that later on. But that's why I want you to understand that at this level it has to be able to bind onto oxygen and hang on to it.
Does hemoglobin carry molecular or elemental oxygen? Is it still bonded, or is it?
I always assumed it was elemental because even though I wrote it as molecular, O2, I just assumed it was a single oxygen molecule.
Okay.
Because it's 4 oxygen molecules that are carried, 1 on each chain.
Okay.
So I've always seen it as O2. I've always written it as O2, but I always assume that it's an oxygen, 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 oxygen.
Okay.
I can't see it though. very small. Now you got me wondering. I just always assumed it was one oxygen molecule. I was always told it was one oxygen molecule per hemoglobin. All right. Dave, where was I?
So you just finished with babies.
I did finish with the babies, so we'll talk about that later on when we get to the reproductive system. We have the bus, we have the red blood cell, go back to the lungs, pick up the oxygen, fill up the seats. Now we have to pump that out to the rest of the body. Well, the lungs don't act as the pump. The heart acts as the pump. So what we have to do is we have to get the blood from the lungs back to the heart again. And that's what happens here. We have the pulmonary veins that are taking the blood back to the heart. But this time it's going to the left side, which we will see is going to eventually pump the blood out to the rest of the body. As it returns, it is going to fill up that top chamber, that left atrium. That left atrium fills up completely, and then it is going to pump it straight down. We will see that when these chambers pump, they have a directional flow, as does the cardiovascular system. It gets pumped into that left ventricle, the ventricle fills up with blood, ventricle contracts from the bottom up, both ventricles contract from the bottom up, squeeze the blood up and out. Blood comes shooting out of the left ventricle at just under 200 miles per hour into the largest artery in the body, the aorta. Big, thick, muscular aorta. From there, the aorta branches off into smaller arteries, which branch off into smaller arteries, which branch off into the smallest arterioles, the smallest of the arteries, which eventually branch off into the capillaries. The capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. This is where the oxygen-carbon dioxide exchange actually takes place. These vessels are so small, red blood cells have to go through single file. So if you can imagine how small a red blood cell is, they have to go through capillaries single file, and in most cases they have to squeeze through. So red blood cells must be flexible. They have to have that ability to wiggle through. As the red blood cells continue through, they will move into the next vessel, which is the smallest of the veins, called venules. From the venules, they will collect into increasingly larger veins, which will eventually empty into either the inferior or superior vena cava, or in some cases the coronary sinus. We're talking about coronary arteries. All right, so basic general breakdown of the heart. Easier to think of as two separate pumps. The whole right side, low in oxygen, its job is to go get oxygen. The whole left side, high in oxygen, its job is to pump that oxygenated blood throughout the body. All right. What else do I want to tell you with this? This is a circulatory system. Circulatory, it's going to go in one continuous circle, so that no matter where we start, eventually we're going to come back to that place again. Which means, when the blood goes from chamber to chamber to chamber to tube, chamber to chamber to chamber to tube, we don't want it going backwards. And because these chambers are so large, so muscular, they carry so much force, if they were just to contract, and this was an opening, an open hole between the top and bottom chambers, much of the blood would go backwards, and that would be terribly ineffective. So instead what we have is we have valves. Valves that allow the blood to go through and then snap shut. And blood goes through and then snap shut. And then blood goes through and then snap shut. This valve right here has 3 leaflets. So we call it the tricuspid. It has 3 cusps. So there's, we call it the tricuspid. It is going to allow blood to move from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then it will snap shut. It has connected to it these little tendons called chordae tendineae, which are attached to the muscular wall of the ventricle itself. That helps to stabilize these flaps, these cusps. From the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, there is a semilunar valve called the pulmonary valve that is going to get forced open as the blood gets pumped up through, and then close as blood tries to come backwards. From the left atrium into the left ventricle, blood is going to pass through a one-way valve that has two cusps, which is why we call it the bicuspid, or the mitral valve. Now, why does this one only have two cusps and the other one has three? Think of the structural integrity, the strength that is required. The more cusps that a valve will have, the weaker each cusp becomes. So imagine a valve that had 10 cusps to it, 10 leaflets. It means it would have to be cut in very thin slices, right? Each cusp would be very thin, which would make it weak. Each one of those would be a place that would be weak. So we have two cusps on this side because the force on the left ventricle is that much stronger. So we only have two on this side to maintain some sort of strength. Now here's the thing about the heart. Oh, and then finally, of course, as it goes from the left ventricle out into the aorta, it must pass through another semilunar valve called the aortic valve, which is kind of easy to remember. Pulmonary valve up to the pulmonary trunk, aortic valve up into the aorta. When the heart, with these four chambers, pumps blood through, you hear a sound like this, right? Well, not really. You hear two heart sounds. Yes, one, yes, two, the lub-dub sounds. That's because it would take a lot more energy. It wouldn't really make sense to have each of these chambers working so independently. It makes more sense to have both of these top chambers fill up at the same time, because then we only require one signal to cause them both to contract at the same time and pump the blood down. And therefore both ventricles will fill up at the same time, and they'll get that same signal to contract at the same time. So when you're hearing that lub-dub sound, what you're actually hearing is not the heart contraction. What are you hearing?
Down and out.
You're hearing the heart valves snap shut. That's what you're hearing. When you're hearing that, you're actually hearing the heart valves snap shut. The first heart sound you hear, the lub sound, the S1, is the sound of the tricuspid and mitral valves closing simultaneously. And the second heart sound you hear, the dub sound, the S2, is the aortic and the pulmonary valves closing simultaneously. All right. So always good to think of the right side of the heart, low in oxygen, left side of the heart is oxygenated. Now, even though the left side of the heart, especially the ventricle, but the whole left side of the heart is full of oxygen. Why? Because it just got all this oxygen, this oxygenated blood from the lungs. So the whole left side of the heart is full of oxygen. Unfortunately, it can't really use much of it. A little bit does diffuse across the membrane and into the inner walls. But in order for the heart to get blood, it has to first pump it out. And the first branches that deliver blood to the heart, coming off the aorta here. The coronary arteries, these are the first branches off of the aorta. Even though, and this is important for you guys to understand later on, even though these are the first branches, you would think, well, they're going to get the blood first, right? It would make sense that the first branches, as soon as the blood gets pumped out of the ventricle. How fast is that blood getting pumped out of that left ventricle?
200.
At just under 200 miles per hour. So it's going to shoot right past the openings. It's not until diastole, it's not until we have that rest, that the blood actually moves backwards and then through these coronary arteries. So it really trickles down. So we really depend on the resting part of the heart in order for the heart to get its blood, interestingly enough. All right. All of the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, we call what? Arteries. All arteries carry blood away from the heart. All arteries carry blood away from the heart. All veins carry blood to the heart. Which means, if I have a vessel that's carrying blood to my foot, what would that be? It would be an artery, right? 'Cause it's going away from the heart. If I have a blood vessel carrying blood to my brain, artery. If it's going to my spleen, artery. If it's going to my pancreas, artery. If it's going
To your lungs.
to my heart,
Vein.
vein. If it's coming from my left knee,
Vein.
then it's going to my heart, right? So we got to call it a vein. You see how that works? Okay. Important to remember, because we have all these arteries that carry oxygenated blood, we have all these veins that carry deoxygenated blood, and this is true with only a few exceptions. We have this pulmonary trunk which branches off in the right and left pulmonary arteries. We have to call them arteries. Why? Because they're taking blood away from the heart. But are they high or low in oxygen? Low. These are the only arteries that are low in oxygen, are the ones that are taking blood to the lung. That makes sense, right? The blood vessels, the four that are coming back from the lungs and coming into the left atrium, these are going to be called what? They're coming from the lungs, that means we have to call them veins, because they're going to the heart. And because they're involved with the lungs, we call them pulmonary, the pulmonary veins. Are they high or low in oxygen? Because they're coming from the lungs. That makes sense? Okay. Now, okay, something that you really need to understand. The heart does a great deal of work with pumping blood through the body, but it doesn't work alone. The arteries have a lot of muscle, a lot of smooth muscle in their walls. The veins have some too, but the arteries really have the maximum amount of smooth muscle in their walls. What does muscle do?
Pushes the blood.
It contracts. So, as the blood comes through this artery, it's going to expand that artery, and then that muscle is going to contract. But if it simply contracts like this, what's going to happen?
Go both ways.
It's going to go in both directions, like squeezing toothpaste from the middle of the tube. So it has to have some sort of directional flow, this peristaltic action, and that's exactly what happens. Because we don't have just one layer of muscle here, we have alternating layers of muscle. They're going to contract to propel the blood in one direction. This is going to be really important when it comes time to talk about things like coronary artery disease or some sort of plaque that's going to stiffen arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis, the arteries. Because if the arteries lose this ability, what's going to be forced to make up the difference?
Heart.
The heart. The heart's going to be forced to make up the difference. Circulation can be split into two systems, pulmonary circulations and systemic circulations. Easy way to remember that, pulmonary circulations is everything involving the lungs. All the blood vessels to, all the blood vessels within, all the blood vessels returning from the lungs is pulmonary circulation. Everything else in the body is systemic circulation. So when we're talking about circulation, pulmonary means all the vessels going to, within, or coming from the lungs. Systemic, everything else. Make sense? Arteries carry blood away from the heart, branch off into smaller arteries, which branch off into arterioles. Arterioles are the smallest of the arteries. These are important because this is where they're entering into capillaries. Arterioles are the step just before capillaries. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there is muscular sphincter. There is the ability at that level to allow less or more blood flow through the capillaries. Kind of important. Notice how capillaries just continue. Arterioles become capillaries, then capillaries are capillaries, and capillaries become venules. So in other words, the blood just coming through, it's dropping off the oxygen, it's picking up carbon dioxide, it's moving on through. A little bit of carbon dioxide actually binds to the hemoglobin, but most of it travels in the form of bicarbonate. Veins differ from arteries because they carry blood toward the heart. Veins have valves and thinner walls. Veins don't have the amount of muscle. They might have a larger lumen, but they have less muscle inside of their walls, and they are under less pressure. And you know this because if you can find a vein on your arm or on your hand, you can't find blood pulsing through it. But if you can find an artery, you can feel the blood pulsing through that. If you cut a vein, blood's going to drip out. If you cut an artery, it's going to have a shower. Veins have valves. This helps maintain unidirectional flow so that it doesn't back up. We will see valves breaking down later on, I think. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe not in this book. All right, so you see a nice little diagram, the difference between pulmonary and systemic circulation. When blood contains high oxygen, blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you, it's always red. It's just more of a purplish red in the veins. Heart is the size of your fist, located about here. The base of the heart's at the top. The apex of the heart is actually at the bottom. This is the apex of the heart. The way to find the apex of your heart is go to your left clavicle, find the middle of your left clavicle, go straight down just beneath the 5th rib, and you'll find the apex of your heart. Your left clavicular line there. The heart is surrounded by a double membrane. Why is that? Well, if you think about the artery, the atria, filling up with blood and then pumping. If you think about the ventricles filling up with blood and pumping, and all this happening inside of this space, you're going to end up with something rubbing against something else. And that's going to create friction. And one thing the body does not like is friction. So we have to come up with a way to lubricate the sides of the heart so that they don't rub up against something and create friction. Now, the way the body does this, and it does this not just in the heart, it does it in other parts of the body. So we will see this concept again. The way that the heart does this, it creates a double layer membrane around itself. So it has 2 layers. It has one layer that's in contact with the heart, then there's a potential space where we have fluid, and then we have another layer on the outside. And that allows these layers just to sort of glide across one another, so there's no friction. The outer layer is always called the parietal layer. The inner layer that's in contact with the heart or with the organ is called the visceral layer. So they might call it parietal pericardium and visceral pericardium, which is great. If you want to learn like that, that's wonderful. If you want to know it as pericardium, I definitely think you should know it as pericardium. But something I want you to take away is that when you have a double layer membrane like this, the outer layer is always the parietal layer, the inner layer that's in contact with the organ itself is always the visceral layer. And then we have this potential space in between where we find the pericardial fluid. Outer layer of the heart is epicardium, the same as the visceral pericardium. The middle part of the heart is the myocardium. This is what makes up the bulk of the heart. The myocardium makes up the bulk of the heart. That's the main muscle of the heart. There is an inner lining called the endocardium. The inner lining is called the endocardium. The reason the heart inside of the ventricles, for instance, has this endocardium is because we want the blood to flow smoothly across the surface. The same reason you put Teflon on a pan, so it goes smoothly across it. This works out so well that the body's continued with the concept outside of the heart and in the lining of the vessels, where we call the epithelium. or the intima. You might hear me refer to it as intima. I learned it as that like that a long time ago, so the two words are interchangeable. And epithelium and intima. The epithelium of the heart is the endocardium. 2 small upper chambers, 2 large lower chambers. The upper chambers are called right atrium, left atrium. Atria is plural, and the right and left ventricles. Remember, blood flow from the right side of the heart is going to go to the right side of the heart. Blood flow from the left side of the heart is going to go to the left side of the heart. In other words, if blood is in the right atrium, the next place it's going to go is where?
Right ventricle.
See what I mean? Here, not here, not here. So right atrium to right ventricle, left atrium to left ventricle. Make sense? I'm telling you, it's amazing how many people miss this on tests because they just get confused very, very quickly. Right atrium to left atrium. And that just doesn't happen, obviously. Hopefully not. Well, it does in babies.
Pre,
I'm sorry?
pre-birth.
Yes.
Or
Hopefully, pre-birth. Not afterwards. Well, hopefully not. All right, separating the chambers. Separating the right and left side, we have a septum. Septum is a wall. Between the atria, it's the interatrial septum. Between the ventricles is the interventricular septum. It's the septum. That is the wall, because we do not want blood to mix. Atrial walls are thinner, not surprisingly. How far do they have to pump blood? An inch. Yes, not far at all. And how much resistance? Not much. The ventricles have to pump against a lot of resistance. Big difference. Superior vena cava. The vena cava is the largest vein in the body. There's superior and inferior part. Now, you'll notice how I drew it. It looks like it's 2 that merge, but that's actually not accurate. That's just for convenience. The reality is, the superior vena cava is going to come in here, and the inferior vena cava is going to come in, apparently at an angle, not really at an angle, through the bottom. There is also, like I said, a coronary sinus, an opening that is taking the blood from the coronary veins, and it dumps directly back into the right atrium. It should be no surprise that the blood from the head, neck, chest, upper extremities, etc. is going to drain superior, and blood from everywhere else lower is going to go into the inferior vena cava.
Are there any kind of valves between the veins coming into either atria?
What do you mean?
Is there any kind of valving, or is it just, is there anything to prevent backflow from the atria into the veins that are feeding them?
No,
Okay.
no, it's just open. Pulmonary trunk, always designated as purple in your textbooks. Arteries are in red, veins are in blue, pulmonary trunk is in purple. Pulmonary veins usually like in orange or something like that. Pulmonary trunk is going to split off into the right and left pulmonary arteries, going to the right and left lungs, the aorta carrying blood to everywhere else. The atrioventricular valves, the AV valves, we just talked about. Tricuspids on the right side, bicuspid or mitral valve is on the left side. The semilunar valves are the ones going from the ventricles either up into the pulmonary trunk or up into the aorta. That's the name, pulmonary and aortic valves. We talked about what the right atrium is. We talked about both the atrium, okay. You can see a nice diagram here. The only thing you can't see is what would be the coronary sinus. That would be coming in right about here. You can see the chordae tendineae that are attached to the wall of the ventricle to help stabilize tricuspid valve. And you can see the thickness in the wall. Cardiac cycle. This is systole versus diastole. Systole is contraction of a chamber and the consequent pumping blood out. Diastole is relaxation of the chamber. When you take blood pressure, you know this hopefully. The top number is the systolic number. The bottom number is the diastolic number, and it is measured in millimeters of mercury, which is designated capital H. Just so you know. Good point. Both atria and ventricles undergo systole and diastole, but usually when discussing heart movement, we refer to ventricular activity. We're talking about systole versus diastole. On the left side, ventricular pressure increases, forcing the mitral valve shut, injecting the blood out of the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve to the ascending aorta. So when blood comes out of the heart, the very first direction it goes is up. Very first direction it goes is up. What are the first branches off the aorta?
Coronary.
No, off the aorta. The first branches off the aorta are the coronary arteries. What are they going to feed?
Your heart.
The heart. And then the aorta goes up. We see these big branches that go over this way, and then one goes up this way, and then one goes directly up to the brain this way. There's the carotid arteries. And then the aorta arches over, and then it descends. And as it descends, it goes through the diaphragm, and it has two big major branches that go left and right off of it. Do you know what those go to?
Femoral.
Not that low. What's the most important organ in our body?
Brain.
Brain, followed by the kidneys. So these two big branches that come off of that abdominal aorta right there, they're going to branch off directly into the kidneys. Kidneys are important. It means the blood. But that also means that kidneys are going to be able to help out with determining how much blood pressure we need, how much blood pressure we have, and how much change we might need. So you'll see a lot of that. You'll see a little bit here, but you'll see a lot of it later on. So you'd be surprised, the kidneys do a lot with regard to blood pressure. All right, so the aorta goes up, then it arches over, then it goes down, and then it goes down through the diaphragm, and then it eventually goes down to the level of the pelvis, where it branches off into the common iliac arteries, which makes sense, right? Ilium, iliac. And then the main branch of each of the common iliac arteries is going to be the, say it, there it is, Brian, femoral, very good.
Tell them I attended. I'm very good communicator.
When you text me on the weekend.
All right, let's take a break, and then I'm going to give you your test back with the adjusted grades that I just asked Danielle to adjust. And we'll come back and